when we talk about what inspires the Lord of the Rings, I have gotten myself in trouble at times when I have alluded to the pagan elements and inspiration that exists within the Lord of the Rings, and I can't help but, with what little exposure I've had to something like Norse mythology or other pagan mythologies, see a lot of those. You might be able to describe them as superficial parallels, but we see a lot of the elements that appear within certainly Norse and pagan mythology. I'm thinking of like the Valar, who were part of that sort of spiritual creation of God in the cosmology of Middle Earth's legendarium, or Tolkien's legendarium, who were spiritual but then took on sort of a physical form and went to go live within the world of Middle Earth, much like the Olympian gods. You could say that about them, right? There are elements of like elves and dwarves that appear in Norse mythology. There are these magical trees that appear in both Norse mythology and in the Silmarillion. And so I wonder, is that just a superficial comparison, or is it because some people will take such a hardline stance on this and say that it's merely a Catholic work, like you had alluded to earlier there, and some, like you said, the many non-Christian fans of the Lord of the Rings will take sort of the opposite end of the spectrum and say, well, no, it's inspired by pagan mythology. Is it more accurate to say that both inspired to some degree, or is it more fundamentally a Catholic Christian work and only superficially sort of pagan inspired?
Well, I'm going to answer your question actually by bringing C.S. Lewis into the discussion, if I may. Um, in The Pilgrim's Regress, he says about the landlord's people. So in that, I don't know if you've read that work. It's very worth reading, because it's basically Lewis's. It's a formal allegory, which is telling of Lewis's own spiritual and intellectual journey to Christianity. But in that, the landlord is God, and the landlord's people are the Jews. And Father History, when speaking to John, says that that only the landlord's people remembered how to read. In other words, only the landlord's people knew the law and understood the covenant between God and men. Everybody else, in other words, the pagans, the Gentiles, this is all obviously pre-Christian, that or everybody else, the pagans, the Gentiles, had forgotten how to read. So what does God do? Does God abandon them? No, says Father History. God sends them pictures, right? Because they can't read, he sends them pictures. And what Father History is saying, or Lewis is saying through the words of Father History, is that the old pagan myths are the way that God spoke to people who no longer knew how to read. So of course, the Greek myths and the Norse myths are ways by which God brought people towards him, not into the fullness of his presence, which ultimately only comes in heaven, but also in a lesser sense in his mystical body on earth, in the church militant. Of course, none of that's possible before God reveals himself in Jesus Christ. Now, does God think, is everybody prior to the birth of Christ going to be condemned to hell because of an accident of birth, because they happened to be born before Jesus? Clearly not. Not least, of course, because God is omnipresent. There is no past and no future for God. The whole of time is present to him. So, and therefore the pagans are his children. And so Tolkien and Lewis understood that that these pagan myths pointed towards Christ in an imperfect way, in a somewhat distorted way, but nonetheless they were groping in the dark or in the twilight towards the light. And again, Lewis makes it perfectly clear the difference, he said, between the pagans. I mean, we can't talk about the modern people as pagans, by the way, and this is Lewis makes this perfectly clear. He said the difference between the pagans and the so-called neo-pagans of our own age is the difference between a virgin and a divorcee. All right, so basically the paganism of the Norse and the Greeks are the virgin awaiting the coming of the bridegroom, whereas the neo-pagans, that are the moderns, the postmoderns, are divorcees that have turned their back on the marriage. Wow. That's the difference between the two. And if we don't make that distinction, we're not understanding what Tolkien and Lewis are doing.
That's a great metaphor or analogy. What do you make of the influence of the demonic within pagan spirituality and cults. And again, I'm referring to pre-Christian paganism, or maybe the paganism that was somewhat existed side by side with Christianity for a time, because there are even church fathers like Athanasius, who says that the gods of the pagan religions were actually demons who had tricked the people into believing that they were divine or that they were good. How do we sort of reconcile some of that, or maybe we just dismiss that and say that was sort of an unfair treatment of the pagan cultures? But given that God is clearly working within those pagan cultures, we think of some of these great thinkers like Aristotle and Plato, who you have to think, if they were so deceived by demonic influence, there's no way they could have arrived at so much truth which can only be connected back to God. And this great tradition of reason, which was synthesized and welcomed into the tradition of the church that came from these pagan cultures. But what about the role of the demonic within these cultures? Do you think that it is apparent, or not?
Yes, basically, of course, you have the presence of the demonic in Christian cultures because demons exist. The question is, do we worship the demons? Do we worship the enemies of the demons? And so obviously you can have certain distorted pagan practices. Chesterton talks about the practice of worshipping Baal or Moloch in the everlasting man, and the sacrificing of newborn infants to the god. Well, that god is certainly demonic, and anybody who's worshipping that god is certainly worshipping demons. But Saint Athanasius, God bless him, because obviously he was so crucial in defeating the Arian heresy. He's in the midst of the fray trying to convert people from paganism towards Christ. You can understand why he doesn't want to blur distinctions. But St. Augustine, who comes just a few decades after him, is very comfortable with taking the best of the pagan old world, as you say, not least of which, of course, being the ideas of Plato, and Aquinas will take the ideas of Aristotle. And if you like, the church baptizes the best of the old pagan world by taking it into itself, making it conform to the teaching of Christ. Where it doesn't, you throw those aspects of paganism out, but where it does, there's no problem at all. So that, if you like, we find that Christ fulfills the law of the Jews, and he fulfills also the reason of Plato and Aristotle, and the desire for God we see in Homer or in Sophocles. He's the fulfillment of that. It's all fulfilled in Christ. And it's no surprise, by the way, that the Gentiles were much more receptive to Christ than the Jews, because the Jews were actually worshipping the law and not the spirit and the God of the law, whereas the pagans were actually seeking the incarnate God in their stories and in their ideas, and were very receptive to the evangelists when they started preaching for them.
I want to shift gears.